Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Class 25. This will be the last class for this week on power and the three faces of power. We're going to be talking about the second and third faces of power, looking at the role, returning to our discussion of interest groups, looking at the media, as well as political culture. This is going to be very schematic, and it's not going to go nearly as much detail into American political culture or the media as we would have without the COVID-19. But hopefully this will give you a sense of the different ways that influence is exerted in American politics. So what contributes to the second phase of power in American politics, and what contributes to the third phase of power? So if we if we review kind of where we left off from Wednesday, we have a model. This is the pluralist model that is pretty much entirely based on the first phase of power. That we have the people who form interest groups to organize into interest groups, as well as people acting independently as voters, try to influence the formal decision-making bodies of Congress, like Congress, state houses, etc., through votes, through organizing into interest groups that can put pressure, whether through money or information or persuasion, on members of Congress to make the formal decisions. But these realms of power also go the other way, with campaigns trying to influence voters to behave in different ways, and interest groups using money to influence those campaigns. But we have this kind of interacting series of groups and individuals trying to influence the behavioral outcomes, trying to get Congress to choose between policy A or policy B. And that's the kind of traditional pluralist model of politics, right? You have groups of people trying to mobilize what resources they can in order to influence decision-making outcomes. So whoever can mobilize the most resources to influence decision-makers wins. But our question for today is, what about the second and third phases of power from Gaventa? What else is missing? What is missing from this model? So one thing that we've been talking about throughout this class is institutional barriers. Now, if we remember, the second phase of power is this idea of non-decisional power. Gaventa talks about it as the mobilization of bias. And here the idea is that it is about preventing issues or grievances from even being brought to the political arena. So if we go back to this chart, it's erecting some sort of barrier here that prevents the people and interest groups from being able to actually influence Congress. It prevents issues from being raised in the first place. So one obvious is issues of institutional design that exclude people from access to power, right? That there are significant limits on direct democracy, right? There's no national referendum or ballot initiative. The people can't just like sign a petition to abolish the Electoral College or something like that. Things like the filibuster rule limit the ability of certain issues to be raised, right? Because you have to get 60 senators on board. Electoral design, rules, single-member districts, and first-past-the-post voting culminating in Duverger's law. So we have two big tent parties rather than a plurality of different political parties. This creates the phenomenon of electoral capture, where minority groups or minority interests are captured by the dominant party and basically can be ignored, right? African Americans are unlikely to vote for Republican candidates, and so the Democratic candidates are unlikely to then listen to African American constituents and actually respond to their interests. A whole series of voting restrictions, restricting non-citizens from voting, that limits certain people's ability to raise issues, even though non-citizen permanent residents are bound by the same laws as citizens. Minors are excluded from voting. Felons, people with felony convictions, and people currently serving prison sentences, depending on the state. Voter registration restrictions that vary state by state, such as voter ID laws, limits on early voting, etc. All of these limit who can actually bring resources to bear. They prevent certain policies and political questions from even arising in the political arena. Now, turning back to interest groups, you're reading from Schattschneider's The Semi-Sovereign People, a 1975 book. Also talks about how interest groups don't just follow the role of the pluralist model of individuals organizing into groups to try to influence politics, but that interest groups themselves serve as a mobilization of bias. That the pluralist model assumes the decision-making arena, what Schattschneider calls the pressure system, is equally open to all and kind of functions like a physics equation. And so whoever kind of has the bigger exerts the most pressure wins the day. But it doesn't account for how these pressure system itself gets structured. And so Schattschneider wants to show how interest groups are mobilizations of bias, and this happens in two ways. First, interest groups themselves there's exclusive membership, right? They exclude access, whether this is through you have to pay dues to the interest group, or just simply because they are based on certain ideological views, right? Someone who wants Second Amendment, wants to reform access to gun rights isn't going to join the NRA, for example. And so the groups themselves are a mobilization of bias, and these, according to Schattschneider, disproportionately represent wealthy and business interests. Why? Because wealthy and business interests have more money to contribute to the groups. So those groups are going to represent, so the poor are going to be less represented in interest group formations. And so Schattschneider writes that the flaw in the pluralist heaven is that the heavenly chorus sings with a strong upper class accent. Probably about 90% of people cannot get into the pressure system, that they just don't have the access to group membership. Now there's a second level here in which he talks about in the second part of the reading that interest groups also serve to privatize conflict, that they want to prevent conflict from going public. That once conflict enters in the political arena, there's too many variables and there's too much uncertainty. So wealthy and business interests have an incentive to resist appeals to the government, to try to settle disputes privately using legal mechanisms or non-legal mechanisms, and basically prevent the government from even hearing this, right? And so you can think of the efforts of groups lobbying of groups like the NRA to pass laws that prevent the United States from researching gun violence as an epidemic, right? That it's preventing the government from even considering the issue. And so that the interest groups here for Schattschneider are both limiting who has access to the decision-making power, but also working to privatize conflict, to prevent issues and grievances from boiling up to formal decision-making. Now, the third thing I want to talk about, and we want to talk about this the most today, is the role of the media in exercising the second and third phase of power. So what is the media? Well, generally, it's the means of public communication and information spread. It's how information publicly, so it's not just like letters or postcards, spreads across a society. And this is distinct from an individual's or corporations or a campaign's professional public relations, because these are usually public. They are not. They're not simply like one unidirectional from a particular person. And this include, when we talk about the media generally, I mean print media, radio, television, the internet, social media. So what does the media do? Well, in its most obvious form, it provides content, whether that's news or entertainment, whether that's anything from nature documentaries to nightly news to political talk shows to sitcoms, right? The main function is provide content, but that content isn't provided for free. They also have to generate revenue. These are corporations. More idealistically, the media can also serve as a public watchdog and assure the accountability of government officials, and that the media can also work to promote the public good by hosting public forums, candidate forums, debates that they can local stations will host like the city council meetings so that people can be informed, right? Now, how has the media evolved over time? Well, in the early days of the American Republic in the late 18th and early 19th century, that the most media was dominated by what's known as the party press. This was the idea here was that these were newspapers, magazines, and leaflets, pamphlets that were printed by the different political parties to advance the public. Most famously with FDR's fireside chats during the Great Depression and World War II. But politicians can communicate directly to the public's ear. They can give speeches that are heard by many more people than traditional rallies. Television then only enhanced this access with the rise of television journalism, with people like Walter R. Murrow and Walter Cronkite, Edward R. Murrow and Walter Cronkite. But this, especially being able to bring, in the latter's case, like images from the Vietnam War into people's living room. But this also, while it might have increased accountability in some sense, it also allowed for televised campaign ads and debates, and allowed for politicians to much directly influence people more viscerally through images and video. Now, television news shifted with the development of cable programming. So in the traditional TV model, as your textbook discusses, there's this affiliate model that these large corporations, NBC, CBS, ABC, Fox, etc., they needed to have local affiliates that would broadcast their programming on the publicly available airwaves to people at home antennas. Now, and that meant that there was going to, because these were publicly available, that kind of shifted the type of content. That had to be much more general purpose content, that you would have entertainment program, that you would have a nightly news that would be very general national news, you'd have local news, but these were the type of content that you would be broadcasting in this model was less specialized and more general interest. With cable and cable subscriptions that you didn't need an affiliate for, and you can increase the number of available channels. That basically any corporation could start a cable channel, and that could be and they could get consumers to pay for access to that cable channel, and allowed for much more specialized programming. So you have everything from the cooking channel to ESPN to Fox News to MSNBC. And these dedicated channels mean that you could have what's now known as a 24-hour news cycle, because you have cable news programs that are always just kind of reporting the minute-by-minute political news that's happening, where in the traditional affiliate model, you would have like the hourly, nightly news that would cover the big stories of the day. Now you have a minute-by-minute update. With the development of the internet in the end of the 20th century, we have the decentralization of the media with the rise of social media. You have the rise of what's known as citizen journalism, of people taking videos of things going on in the world, posting them to YouTube, Twitter, social media, and those being picked up by more traditional media outlets and then spread throughout the information ecosystem. But while this decentralization has allowed for more information, it's also allowed for the spread of misinformation, as we all kind of know all and well from the 2016 election. So how does the media get regulated? Well, the First Amendment places severe limits on this. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. So this is the idea of a free press, and the founders believed that a free press was a necessary safeguard to democracy, to these Republican values. However, there are limits. There are limits they're known as slander and libel laws. Slander is the idea that is when you speak false information with the intent to harm a person or entity. Libel is when you print it. Now, not everything is slander or libel. They only occur when the false information is presented as fact. So it doesn't cover opinions or editorials, and it's up to the defamed individual or company to bring a lawsuit against the media outlet. And the courts have different standings whether or not you are a public figure or a private figure. There's a greater threshold if you are a public figure, than fewer things are slander or libel. But there's also limitations on the publication of classified material. This came to that the media cannot classify publish without redactions classified material for the sake of national security. And this came to a head during the Vietnam War, when the Washington Post and the New York Times tried to publish what are known as the Pentagon Papers, or evidence on what the true state of the war in Vietnam was. This eventually went to the court. Of the Pentagon Papers, but they could not reveal troop movements or the names of undercover operatives. Now, there are more formal legal regulations, and these have evolved over time. The first main law was in 1927, the Radio Act, and this created limits on obscene or biased material to preserve the public interest. In 1934, the Communications Act was passed, which created the Federal Communications Commission to enforce regulations and as well as determine what is appropriate content. Now, the FCC has operated under a few different doctrines over its tenure. It uses what's known as the equal time rule, that candidates running for public office have to be given equal time on programming. So if a news show is going to interview the Democratic candidate, they have to give equal time if the Republican candidate requests it to the Republican candidate. And this doesn't just count for news, but also includes comedy shows. This was more recently in the case, like Saturday Night Live, this is why during the 2012 election there were a bunch of different primary contenders running for office for the Republican nomination that were on Saturday Night Live because they appealed for getting that equal time. Now, distinct from the equal time rule is what's known as the Fairness Doctrine, which was in effect between 1949 and 1987. And this was that any time that the news media covered something in their news programming, they had to cover it in a balanced way. So they had to give fair time to both sides of the issue. The FCC has also enforced indecency and obscenity regulations, preventing pornography and obscene language and excessive violence on news and setting on the media and setting different standards for that. And in 1996, the Telecommunications Act of 96 dropped limits on how many stations a media conglomerate can own. And we'll talk about this in a second, but this really led for both the expansion and concentration of the media. So these changes in the regulatory environment, plus the expansion of the internet and social media, means that on the one hand, we have this proliferation of media. There's like more news websites now than one could even possibly conceive of. But at the same time, the Telecommunications Act of 96 meant that you also have the agglomeration of media, that media ends up being concentrated into large media conglomerates that own multiple different television, radio, and print journalism programs. So in 1983, as you can see here, 50 companies owned 90% of all media outlets, while in 2019, only 6, Comcast, Disney, Fox, Time Warner, Viacom, and CBS own 90% of all media in circulation. So you can think about how this might affect barriers to entry when you have such when most of the media is being produced and owned by a small subset of very large corporations. So how does the media exert the second phase of power? The main way that it can do so is with this phenomenon of agenda setting, or the ability to choose which issues or topics deserve public discussion. So what is going to be on the nightly news? What is going to be on the front page of the New York Times or the Los Angeles Times? That's going to determine what issues people think of as meaningful and what issues are brought to bear. So you can look here. This is a study on cable news coverage of last year between the Notre Dame fires that occurred, the fire in Notre Dame Cathedral, and the segments mentioning the Amazon rainforest fires that happened later. And you can notice that there was significantly more coverage of the Notre Dame fires, and that shapes what issues get brought forward to the decision-making sphere. And so this is ultimately, and when we add to this the mobilization of bias, right? That these media conglomerates are large, they have large vested corporate interests, that they're going to set the agenda around issues that are beneficial to them, no matter how kind of objective they claim to be, that they are going to set the agenda in ways that are beneficial to them. So they're going to create limits on access to the decision-making arena. So we can return to our pluralist model here, and we can add in this non-decisional power, these different ways that bias is mobilized, from institutional barriers, interest group membership and exclusions, privatization of conflict, and media agenda setting. And this creates a huge filtering mechanism to determine what issues and people actually get access to the formal decision-making. So what about the third phase of power? This also means that according to Schattschneider, that a lot of these interest groups here are as much exerting the first face of power, but also the second face of power by creating barriers for ordinary people to enter, right? So we have to kind of think of these interest group actions as not just in the pluralist model. So how can the media exert ideological power? Well, there's lots of debate over what the media's influence is. Walter Lippmann, in the mid-century, had a theory known as the hypodermic theory, that basically the media directly influenced, like a hypodermic needle. It injected opinions into the public sphere because he was convinced that the public didn't actually have any opinions by themselves. But more recent scholars have argued that there's probably minimal effects that the media has. That there's no real changes in public opinion based on media outcomes. More nuanced studies have found a cultivation theory in which it's not so much that the media tells you what to think, but they help develop a worldview by presenting it as a shared reality. And this occurs mostly through framing effects, or creating narrative and context that affects how the same information is perceived and understood. So this is one of the most famous kind of forms of media framing here, the difference between how the same type of activity is framed as looting versus as finding based on in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, based on the race of the person. And so this way that these things get framed limits on how you present that information, what type of narrative you provide, whether you focus on the details and engage in episodic framing, or focus on the broader issues with a more thematic framing with fewer details. It's going to affect how the same information is perceived by the public. But the media also, there's been significant studies finding different biases in the media. As this framing effect suggests, there's a high degree of racialized bias. The media is more likely to discuss crime and poverty in the context of race. Often when crime and poverty are discussed, they will include images of African Americans and other racial and ethnic minorities. There's also a gender bias that women candidates and business leaders receive less positive media coverage than men, and women are less likely to run for office than men. So many have found a kind of correlation between the media bias and their likelihood to run. Now, conglomeration in cable news also allows for the creation of partisan echo chambers. So we can look here at the creation of different partisan media here. And so let me just get my pen out here. So we can see here on the y-axis we have on the y-axis we have what is the quality of the media? Is it providing mostly fact reporting originally? Is it just kind of reproducing existing facts? Is it providing analysis, or is it opinion? Or is it like all the way down here, propaganda and misleading information? And then a left to right spectrum. So we can so that the ideal kind of forms of media are up here. They're going to be mostly neutral or minor skews, but providing, they're providing fact-based reporting. This is going to be the least likely to be biased, right? Then as we move farther down and farther to the sides, right, we get more and more biased medias. And so here, these partisan medias, especially if you're getting all of your news from here or all of your news from here, you're going to end up having a very misleading conception of the world. It might be incomplete or false conception of the world, but it's also going to be different framings and articulations of what's important that's going to shape how you perceive the same reality. And that's going to shape what you think is important and the types of ideas and political grievances that you raise. So an example of this has been recent studies. These are Pew data. This is research from Pew that has found that based on the type of media that you consume, people are likely to understand the coronavirus outbreak differently. So Republicans and people who lean Republicans, who mostly get their outlet from right-leaning sources, basically think that the generic news media has greatly 30%, where Republicans who get their news from without right-leaning audiences, that's a much smaller proportion here. Now, there's a general partisan divide here between people who believe, between Republicans and Democrats based on whether or not the media has exaggerated the risk here, but it's intensified here by the consumption of right-wing media. And this also means that there's going to be different accounts of where the coronavirus came from. If you consume only right-leaning media and you're lean Republican or Democrat, you're more likely to believe that the coronavirus is developed in a lab rather than came about naturally. Where if you are Republican or lean Republican and consume non-biased media, then that flips. Again, there's general partisan disagreements here too. So what else can exert ideological power? If we go back to our reading from several weeks ago from Lacombe on the NRA, right? Remember that the NRA influences public policy not just by mobilizing resources, but by activating polarized social identities, by appealing to people's conceptions of freedom and what a true American is, conceptions of masculinity, conceptions of kind of Americana. And that these are not necessarily the pluralist model, but these are ways of shaping people's values and myths and culture. The final thing that I'm going to talk about is the idea of American political culture. And this is the broader attitudes, beliefs, and values of a society that are widely shared. And these are not like outright information or propaganda, but shared conceptions of meaning. Now, in the supplemental reading for today, Roger Smith discusses what's known as the liberal thesis that was originally challenged by Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America. And he argued that American culture was driven by a passion for equality and liberal ideas of freedom and equality. The political scientist Louis Hartz in the 20th century developed this idea by saying that because European settlements in North America never had a feudal phase, there was never feudalism in North America, that the United States political culture was a generic liberalism, and that explains why we don't have a socialist party. So on the one hand, this default liberalism and individualism in the United States can shape the way we think about politics. There are myths of the rugged individualism, the lack of socialist party, weaker labor movements compared to in continental Europe, and our general kind of the way that we divide political questions as a debate between individualism and collectivism are all shaped by this liberal understanding. But Smith also wants to supplement this liberal thesis by saying that we actually have multiple traditions. That even when we had even among liberals, that there was, and he writes on page 549 of the article, that men were thought to be naturally suited to rule over women. White Northern Europeans were thought superior culturally and probably biologically to Black Africans, Bronze Native Americans, and all other races and civilizations. There was discrimination based on religion. So even self-proclaimed liberals, the people who are talking about the equality of all men, clearly didn't mean it. So Smith argues that American politics should be understood as the interaction of multiple political traditions, including liberalism and republicanism, but also what he calls ascriptive forms of Americanisms. And these ascriptive hierarchies are looking at traits of race, ethnicity, national origin, gender, or religion to draw distinctions between real Americans and others. And this means, and this, Smith argues, helps explains why we see these contradictory advocacies and institutions in the United States. Racism and sexism aren't merely aberrations of a general liberal trend, but are parts of American political culture and ideology that are unevenly kind of balanced with our liberal political culture. This is why we don't see straight lines of progress, right? That why we see some social progress and then it backtracks, right? We have the abolition of slavery and Reconstruction, and then we have Jim Crow. And these aren't always explicitly written into law, though they sometimes are, but they shape the way that people understand issues and political controversies here. And that while just as much as the liberal thesis shapes us, that we're also shaped by these ascriptive hierarchies. So if we return back to our picture here, sorry, that order went wrong. We can look back and see that through American political culture and media framing and bias as well contribute shared meaning and culture that people have, the ideas that people have before we even get to them forming interest groups or trying to mobilize political campaigns. That these political culture and media framing affect what people even conceive of as political issues before they even try to mobilize and before they encounter these non-decisional power. So when we compare this kind of much more complex picture to this simplified picture, we get more of a nuanced sense of how policymaking is actually influenced by these varieties of factors, and how you could have a mobilization of people over an issue, and then the actual policy outcome that comes out of it, even if there is significant amount of public support for an issue, might look very different than what the people actually clamored for. You can see this right now with the stimulus bill that was passed in response to the coronavirus outbreak, that many people find that it is an unsatisfying stimulus bill that includes mostly a bunch of bailouts and subsidies for large corporations. And that is in turn shaped by all these intersecting forms of power and influence. Now, if this chart looks confusing and messy, I wanted to share with you my rough draft of how this chart would look. I was originally going to show this chart to try to organize how the different forms of power all interact with each other, but then my partner publicly shamed me on the internet for the complete nonsense and derangement of this chart. So you get the much more cleaner conception, right, with the red being the first phase of power, the blue being the second face of power, and the green being this third face of ideological power. So next class, we're going to move away from power and talk about liberty and civil liberties in this country, and both how they have evolved over time and what civil liberties are constitutionally guaranteed. Now, for your last opportunity to do a discussion post for the week, what implications do these overlapping, intersecting, and aggregating dimensions of power have on public policy making, the reality of the United States' Republican values? So how well are we actually able to be a republic in the sense that Federalists are talking about? Or the possibilities of meaningful political reform? You can choose one of these three. You don't have to talk about all of them. How does this conception of power change the way you think about American politics? Now remember, you have till Friday at midnight, Friday the 3rd, to write a 200-word post on any of the 3 discussion threads that I've posted for this week. And you also have to reply to a peer's post with a 100-word reply by midnight on Sunday. So that is it for today, and that is going to be it for this week. I hope that this week has gone more smoothly than last week. Hopefully everyone is settling into the groove of remote teaching and learning. Let me know if you have any questions or access problems. I'm happy to chat over office hours or during office hours or over email to make sure that you're able to get access to the material and that you're able to get a good understanding of this material. As always, stay healthy, stay safe, take care of each other, and I will see you all next week. Bye-bye.